Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Thank you for joining me for today's exploration of Tolkien, Tartaria, and the Old World. Or is it Middle-earth and Arda? Today we're going to be exploring the connections between the brilliant imagination of J.R.R. Tolkien and his original creations of Arda and Middle-earth. Everyone is well familiar with the Lord of the Rings movie series, and I believe that's the most profound example in popular culture where there's the greatest amounts of connections with J.R.R. Tolkien. But what can we say about the amazing history and world that this creative genius brought forth from his own mind? What are the connections with what he created and the old world? Was he talking about a fantasy land? Or was he really talking about something that he believed actually existed? The images that we have from the beautiful world he created, he called it Arda, or as the Middle Lands where most of the plot took place was called Middle-earth. This is the Halls of Mandos, and this is in Valinor, a land that was part of Arda but would eventually be beyond the reach of human beings in the story. A beautiful hall where the souls of the dead would go to wait for the final battle. Here, an amazing depiction of Thorondor, Lord of the Eagles, fighting in Calagon, the greatest of the dragons made by the Dark Lord Morgoth, during the War of Wrath in the First Age. Here, the Dark Lord Morgoth, pictured with Ungoliant the spider, as they open up the trees of light to suck their energy and darken the world again. And both Dark Lords, the major antagonists of Tolkien stories, with Morgoth, the greatest Dark Lord of all, pictured on the left of the Ainur, and Sauron, featured in the Lord of the Rings movies, and a Maiar spirit, the same kind of spirit that the wizard Gandalf was, also in the movies. Who was J.R.R. Tolkien? Well, I'll confess to you that for the longest time, when I first read the Lord of the Rings books when I was a boy, I mispronounced the name like many other people. I thought it was J.R.R. Tolkien. His full name is John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, not Tolkien. Was an English writer and philologist. He lived from 3 January 1892 to 2 September 1973. So on the tail end of the 19th century, a questionable time period in our research. He was the author of the high fantasy works The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and he had many more creative inspirations to his credit. From 1925 to 1945, Tolkien was the Rawlinson and Bosworth Professor of Anglo-Saxon and a Fellow of Pembroke College, both at the University of Oxford. He then moved within the same university to become the Merton Professor of English Language and Literature and Fellow of Merton College, and held these positions from 1945 until his retirement in 1959. He was a close friend of C.S. Lewis, a co-member of the informal literary discussion group The Inklings. He was appointed a Commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II on 28 March 1972. After Tolkien's death, his son Christopher published a series of works based on his father's extensive notes and unpublished manuscripts, including the Silmarillion. These, together with The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, form a connected body of tales, poems, fictional histories, invented languages, and literary essays about a fantasy world called Arda, and within it, Middle-earth. Between 1951 and 1955, Tolkien applied the term legendarium to the larger part of these writings. And in closing, Tolkien really brought about to popular culture the concept of high fantasy. But was this just high fantasy? Or was there a lot more that came from the brilliant mind of this remarkable man? Someone whose literary works rival the greatest literary works in all of the human languages. Now, why do we give such accolades to Tolkien? Well, let's look at his upbringing a little bit. This is the Birmingham Oratory, where Tolkien was a parishioner and altar boy. Very remarkable building, and in the United Kingdom, we see that this is yet another old world building. We tend not to focus as many explorations on Europe or the United Kingdom because the official narrative we're given tells us that these lands have been settled and built upon for hundreds of years, so one would think it makes sense. But it's still worthy of great explorations, and this building is no exception. We have the remarkable dome rotunda, we have the columns that we see in so many old world constructions. No doubt that when Tolkien saw this with his open mind, he questioned it. He wondered, how was it such a building could exist? What did it really tell him, and what did it inspire within him? And for the record, I have the greatest amount of respect for J.R.R. Tolkien and his works, and this entire video will be a tribute to that. I also want to share with viewers that I do have a little bit of a confirmation bias because Tolkien books were the very first books that I read that were really high fantasy. So I'm acknowledging that as we go forward in this exploration. Here we have the free grammar school where Tolkien was a pupil, and then on the right a picture of his family. It's not known to most that the Tolkien name actually emanates from Prussia, or what would later be East Germany, in the town of Königsberg. It's worth noting that Königsberg Castle, before World War I, pictured on the left here, another amazing old world building with all the remarkable telltale signs that we see. Even the picture of this road with the tracks, and then of course we have the horse-pulled trolley vehicle, something else we see a lot. This castle was destroyed on Brezhnev's orders. Interesting that it lasted until 1969, since this castle was supposedly a headquarters of the Teutonic Knights, a military order that Russia sees as one of its greatest antagonists in history, and Russia's struggle against the Teutonic Order is one of their greatest aspects of national identity. And yet, this wasn't destroyed until 1969. Well, I guess Joseph Stalin was too busy outmaneuvering the United States, despite the fact the United States was a nuclear-armed nation, and his nation was not nuclear-armed, and yet he was able to achieve many policy victories. Discussion for another time. On the right, you see the 14th century Königsberg Cathedral. Another amazing, beautiful, old-world building. Now, we don't focus as many explorations yet on Europe, but they're not any less worthy of our depth and attention, and we'll be getting to them. And I just find it interesting that the origin of Tolkien's family comes from an area that is something that we've examined in explorations before, and it was one of my very early videos on the channel when we showed the Book of Germany and what was being displayed to American service members after World War II. Now let's consider Tolkien's war service, because this is really something that defined him. We know that Tolkien served in World War I after he was married, and we'll just read a little excerpt about what kind of person Tolkien really was. On 5 June 1916, Tolkien boarded a troop transport for an overnight voyage to Calais. Like other soldiers arriving for the first time, he was sent to the British Expeditionary Forces base depot at Etaples. On 7 June, he was informed that he had been assigned as a signals officer to the 11th Service Battalion, Lancashire Fusiliers. The battalion was part of the 74th Brigade 25th Division. While waiting to be summoned to his unit, Tolkien sank into boredom. To pass the time, he composed a poem titled The Lonely Isle. The guy was always creative, no matter what he was doing, which was inspired by his feelings during the sea crossing to Calais. To evade the British Army's postal censorship, yes, good old censorship, he developed a code of dots by which Edith, that's his wife, could track his movements. He left Etaples on 27 June 1916 and joined his battalion in Rumpere near Amiens. He found himself commanding enlisted men who were drawn mainly from the mining, milling, and weaving towns of Lancashire. According to John Garth, he felt an affinity for these working-class men, but military protocol prohibited friendships with other ranks. Instead, he was required to take charge of them, discipline them, train them, and probably censor their letters. If possible, he was supposed to inspire their love and loyalty. Tolkien later lamented, "The most improper job of any man is bossing other men. Not one in a million is fit for it, and least of all those who seek the opportunity." So I share this excerpt because I think it's a great overview of what kind of person J.R.R. Tolkien truly was at heart. Battle of the Somme. He arrived at the Somme in early July 1916. In between terms behind the lines at Beauzencourt, he participated in the assaults on the Schwaben Redoubt and Leipzig salient. Tolkien's time in combat was a terrible stress for Edith, who feared that every knock on the door might carry news of her husband's death. Edith could track her husband's movements on a map of the Western Front. So I think we see the origin of where Tolkien got this amazing ability to make maps, and maps are something you always find with any Lord of the Rings book. The Reverend Mervyn S. Evers, Anglican chaplain to the Lancashire Fusiliers, recorded that Tolkien and his fellow officers were eaten by hordes of lice, which found the medical officer's ointment merely a kind of ars d'oeuvre, and the little beggars went at their feast with renewed vigor. Does not sound like a pleasant experience. On 27 October 1916, as battalion attacked Regina Trench, Tolkien contracted trench fever, a disease carried by lice. He was invalided to England on 8 November 1916. So quite an experience, and we see someone who has a remarkable sympathy for human beings and did not enjoy the concept of being an officer or a leader. And there's a saying that many officers' primary job in military forces across the world is to get their soldiers killed. Now, this might not be a popular saying, but it is something that you hear, especially when you discuss things with enlisted personnel. And I'll be honest, I've even had officers in certain NATO armies tell me flat out that their job is to get soldiers killed. Quite a remarkable concept, and interesting that they were open about that. I don't know if they were being serious or if they were just joking with me, but you can certainly see for yourself what's happened in the results. Nevertheless, this shows how Tolkien was formed as an individual when he was younger and the experience in the Great War. Now let's transition over to the world that Tolkien envisioned. Tolkien meant Arda, which was what he called his fantasy world, to be our own green and solid earth, seen here in the Baltistan Mountains at some quite remote epoch in the past. So it's stated in many different places that Tolkien meant Arda to be our earth, our land in the distant past. He meant that and he intended it. And now let's look at the world that he envisioned. The early world of Arda. He saw it on a plane or a disc, and it was lit initially in the First Age or in the times before the First Age, the way that he organized the timelines or eras in his world. The two lamps of Arda, which were the only lamps that initially lit the land, and this is all there was. And then as time progressed, once the lamps were destroyed by the evil forces of Morgoth, and if you're not familiar with the history, this comes from the Silmarillion, which was the amazing collection of tales and legendarium that Tolkien worked on for years to completely outline all the legends and all the myths to understand the origin of this world. It's quite remarkable, and it is a huge amount of information. But following the destruction of the lamps, the world was lit by the two trees of the Valinor, and the land was divided by a sea. And you have Middle-earth, and that's the name. Middle-earth comes from the fact that it's actually in the middle of the disc-shaped existence, or the land. And Aman, or Valinor, which was where the gods, or the Valar, resided. And it was lit by two trees, and you saw a picture of what happened to those two trees earlier, where the Dark Lord Morgoth allowed the spider Ungoliant to suck the life from both trees, killing them and darkening the world again. Then the Valar brought about the moon and the sun, or should I say Eru, who is what Tolkien calls the god of Arda, or his name for god of Arda. And the moon and sun orbit the world and Middle-earth, lighting it at all times, and preventing Morgoth from darkening the world again, with light during the day and light at night. Very interesting myth, and you can say that it's inspired from many of the other myths that come from Anglo-Saxon or Germanic tribes or whatever from the Western world. And yet there's so many connections all across our land and from many different cultures, and many of these myths actually have so much similarity to them it's not even funny. And now let's look at how Arda changed, how it went from being a flat world of the Second Age to the round world of the Third Age. These are the most interesting concepts that Tolkien presented us, because Middle-earth in the Second Age was the flat disk land, and the great kingdom of Numenor. Numenor was a kingdom of men who were friends of the elves, and Tolkien has his various species that he uses in Middle-earth, and the main species include elves, which are wisest and fairest of the races. It includes men or human beings who are not as wise and as fair as the elves, and yet they have the most potential for the afterlife. And then the dwarves. And it's a very remarkable amalgamation of societies, and sometimes they have their own conflicts, especially in The Hobbit, and many times they fight in alliances against the dark forces that are led either by Morgoth in the First Age or Sauron in the Second, Third Age. Numenor was the great kingdom of human beings, and you can see it as an analogy to Atlantis. And when this kingdom was corrupted by the influences of Sauron, and they tried to sail to Valinor to attack the land of the gods, Numenor sunk in an amazing disaster, much as Atlantis is said to have done. And then the world was changed. And the whole point of the world being changed was to prevent human beings and the creatures that still resided on it from reaching the land of the Valinor. Nevertheless, the elves still had a gateway, a capability to sail from a world that was sealed off to the land of the Valinor. And you even see this at the end of The Lord of the Rings and The Return of the King, when the elves depart and they take Frodo with them. And Bilbo as well, the two main Hobbit characters. If you're not familiar with the movies, I can certainly recommend them. But in any event, these concepts are remarkable because of the fact that it shows a mentality for how the shape of the land can be changed, for how access from one land to the other could possibly function. Could Tolkien have been referring to the ways that our world or our lands have been changed? Was he inspired by something that was a little more realistic and a little more remarkable? It's hard to say, and yet we can't ignore the many connections. And there are so many connections from what Tolkien imagined in his world and the things that we explore in our world and the things that we observe, and not just in our own account of history that we're given, but also in so many other forms of myth. There are many connections, and it applies to all societies and all cultures across the land. And then finally, what was Tolkien saying about the Third Age to the Sixth and the Seventh Age? He believed that the other races, and there were more, I didn't mention them all, there were Ents and there were Hobbits. Didn't mention the Ents, they were the gigantic tree creatures. They dwindle and disappear, the continents break up and rearrange, and we could be in the Sixth or Seventh Age. And you see that this concept of ages matches many of the theories that we have of eras or how the world could have progressed. And it's very clear that Tolkien believed that he was really relating to us something more than just a fantasy tale. And of course, this will be dismissed by many people in the mainstream, but yet when you read Tolkien's work and you see the amount of detail into it, it's just astonishing. It's astonishing the amount of detail that went into creating this so-called fantasy world. And did you know that Tolkien created his own languages for Middle-earth and for Arda? High Elvish, a written language, all of it came from his mind. And I think that's just remarkable. And even if you don't believe in any connections from Tolkien and the old world or the subsequent existence of a civilization that preceded ours that we refer to as Tartaria, you have to admit it's quite amazing that one individual was able to imagine an entire world, create an entire history for an entire world, and in addition to that, create languages, written languages with many variations on these languages. I find this unbelievably remarkable, and I think this should all prove to us that there is the capability to create the existence of other worlds and other lands just from our minds. Now, are they just written tales and they're just high fantasy? Or could they be something much more? I leave that question to you. Here's a map of Beleriand, which was lands featured in the First Age, and Beleriand was an amazing land, and it was where the elves that followed Morgoth after he stole the Cimmerals from Valinor settled and developed their initial kingdoms. And I mention it because Beleriand was sunk below the ocean and the land was changed after the First Age. A reference to resets. And there were many resets in Tolkien's world, and that's how he divided up the ages. You have the breaking of Beleriand, you have the sinking of Numenor, you have the consistent and constant changing of the lands with each different age, just as we say for each different era in our own theories. And I go back to the image of the Tower of Babel because that is something that's featured in many mythologies, and yet it's a significant connection point because it also refers to the story of languages and how human beings were once stated to have spoken the same language and have an understanding. Even if they had different cultures, even if they had their own local customs and traditions, there was a time that they worked together and they understood each other. Are there connections between this and the world that Tolkien imagined? I believe that there are, but maybe it's just a fantasy, and I could well be wrong. But there's too many connections to simply ignore. And finally, the concept of imagination and creativity, the greatest attributes, I think, to any human being. Where did this whole concept of the Ultima Tower come from? Why would we be conceptualizing things that are supposedly beyond our ability to construct or architect? And this is not the only building. There are many great buildings that have been conceptualized, and we'll be talking about them in a subsequent video. But I think it relates to Tolkien and some of the amazing structures that he envisioned in his stories of Arda. or Middle-earth. And it all falls back into the 5 eras, and you'll find many myths and many aspects dividing up the epochs of time, ages, the eras, whatever we want to call them. And that's something that I use as a framing device in the research that I do on this channel, because it's one way to visualize what may have happened in the past, what really happened in the past. Is this necessarily correct? No. Do I consider this a living document that can change, and will I likely change it if evidence or what we have as significant evidence may change when the resets occurred or what we understand of the past? Absolutely. Because this is research and this is exploration that we're doing. And things will always change as we learn more. Perceptions may change. So that's why it's important to keep an open mind and not be settled into one simple belief system just because it's comfortable for us. One of the concepts that Tolkien had that was reflected in both our own mythology is the decline of longevity of men or human beings. And in his world, there was once a time when human beings lived much longer, especially those who were considered the elf friends. And there's a deleted line in the film The Two Towers where we find out that Aragorn, or Strider, is actually 87 years old. And that's because he's one of the Dunedain, gifted with long life. And it matches many of the things that we see in our own mythological works, or it could be an accurate historical tale. It depends on your perception. The decline of the longevity of human beings in the Bible, when we said that individuals from times in the past lived much longer, 800 to 1,000 years, and as time went on, their lifespans declined. And yet we're told that that just doesn't apply. That's just a silly myth, and it's not real. But you really have to wonder because it appears in many different locations. Finally, let's talk about the nature of the existence of the orcs. The orcs, the legend in Tolkien's Arda, came from the elves. The elves said to be the wisest and fairest of beings, but many elves, after their awakening or their creation by Eru, were captured by the Dark Lord Morgoth. They were taken underground and they were tortured and mutilated until they became the orcs, as depicted here. Are there races and are there legends of species that may have been similar, or human beings who were tortured, mutilated, or even just changed through processes we can't possibly understand? We have many hints and clues throughout our literature and our existing, what we're told are fantasy books. But is this fantasy? There are many other explorers and many other examples that have looked at expecting to encounter things such as blimmies, which are these creatures that don't really have heads and their faces are in their chests. It sounds strange and it sounds bizarre and otherworldly. And yet, could there be something more to it? I think it's a possibility we have to consider. And we know for a fact that our modern governments do not have any reluctance in terms of testing things on human beings and what they do. So it's something important to keep in mind what may have happened in the past with the corruption of previous existing civilizations and societies. What were they really willing to try on their human beings, and how did they change them? And for the record, I do not believe that this is the worst way that human beings can be corrupted. It's terrible, there's no doubt about it. But I do believe that there are worse ways that human beings can be corrupted. What are you talking about? Ah, Carl, what are you doing here? Look, we have a contract for you to be on the channel. Listen. You are saying things that are just completely out in left field, and I am here to get the audience tied back onto the actual concepts of science. You have said things that I think are just utterly absurd, and as part of our agreement, I need to come here and set the record straight. All right, Carl, I'll let you speak. What have you got to tell us? Well, let me explain to you in Cosmos. My successful series, Cosmos, talked about evolution. And I spelled out evolution for everyone. And I want to spell it out for your viewers now. You know that Cosmos was a very successful show on the public broadcasting service. Listen, Carl, I think Cosmos was well made, and I do acknowledge that a lot of the success came from this gentleman pictured on the left, Vangelis, a remarkable composer. I mean, the music of Cosmos is something that's remembered, and interestingly enough, you can still purchase the soundtrack. All right, that's enough. Yes, the music was good, but I want to tell you about the cosmic calendar. The cosmic calendar is the actual history of the world. It is not this absurd fantasy that you continue to share. Human beings have only been around recently in the cosmic calendar, and the process of evolution took millions of years. And let me show you how evolution may have started. You see, you were originally a polyp with tentacles that guided things into your primitive mouth. You then evolved. We have cousins the starfish, but we are not descended from starfish. You came from a polyp with primitive tentacles and a primitive mouth. That is all you are. Listen, Carl, I know that's part of what you said, and I've got to admit that the computer imagery that you used in the late 1970s was impressive for its time. But what exactly do you get between a polyp and a starfish? I mean, you say that this takes millions of years. What's the creature that comes between these? I mean, this just looks like an instantaneous transition. Look, don't ask questions. Evolution is a fact. It really happened. Okay, Carl, we'll just let that stand. Just instantaneous transitions from one life form to the other, and they just did it right away, and there was no problems. By the way, Carl, I've been meaning to ask you, how exactly are you able to join us? Because with all due respect, didn't you pass away in 1996? Well, I'm glad you asked that, and I will answer that question for you and your viewers now. You see, when Voyager 1 was launched, I had my memory engrams impressed upon Voyager 1. So, my mind will live forever in space, and I am able to take part in contributing to your channel. And did you know that because of our amazing technology available in the 1970s, that an old Commodore computer can be used to communicate with Voyager 1 despite it being nearly 14.8 billion miles away? Billions and billions of miles away, and yet you can still talk to me, and I can still grace you with my presence. The Deep Space Communications Network makes it possible. Amazing technology of the 1970s. It is not metaphysical, it is science, that I am still with you. Speaking of, how exactly are you compensating me for my contributions to your channel? Well, Carl, I thought we would just pay you an apple pie. Ah, yes. Thank you very much. Well, I think that's all I have to say. Well, there you go. That's Carl Sagan and his scientific interpretation of what you just watched. In any event, make your own conclusions. Tolkien is a very remarkable and creative author, and I think we can all agree on that. And I think there's a lot more that he says that connects to the old world in Tartaria. And I think there's a lot to research and explore in his world. As always, ask questions, explore yourself, and you'll restore the world. Please like, comment, and subscribe.